Hello and welcome and happy International Women's Day. I'm Meagan Day, staff writer at Jacobin magazine, and this is a Jacobin Talk. And I'm joined today by Kristen Ghodsee. Kristen is a professor of Russian and East European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also a contributor to both Jacobin and to our sister journal, Catalyst. And she's the author of the excellent book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, among other books. And she's the author of Have You Wished Your Mother a Happy International Women's Day Yet in the New York Times. We want to thank all of you for tuning in. We know that you had a lot of choices this evening. For example, you could be tuning in instead to this event. That is an International Women's Day Democratic Party fundraiser featuring Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, and celebrity model Chrissy Teigen. Clinton's and Pelosi's understanding of International Women's Day seems to differ from ours a bit, wouldn't you say, Kristen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was really surprised when I saw that announcement. And the other thing that's really funny about that announcement is in very, really tiny letters, it says that it's a virtual event to fundraise for women candidates and other Democrats, right? So it's not even just a fundraiser for women. It seems like a real kind of co-optation of the radical history of this holiday.
So it funnels the money.
It funnels the money, yeah.
The sort of concept of women. It's a far cry from. I brought this out of my hallway. This is a poster from Lithuanian International Women's Day, 1968. So how did we get from this to that is kind of the question facing us this evening. We are going to spend a lot of time talking about the history of International Women's Day as promised, but in order to fully understand and appreciate the distance we've traveled from its origins to its present, I think we should spend a little bit of time dwelling on what International Women's Day means in our current political and cultural moment. So I've plucked out some good examples. And before we start, I want to say that this, it's obviously a far cry from the origins of International Women's Day, and that is not that's nothing new, right? Like the complete ignorance of and subsumption of socialist history into sort of liberal girl bossiness actually happens pretty frequently, and it reminds me of this thing that happened a few years ago, which is that Chelsea Clinton published a book called She Persisted that had a chapter on Clara Lemlich. So Clara Lemlich was a young Jewish immigrant garment worker and a labor militant. She participated in the Uprising of 20,000. It was an incredible labor strike in the garment district in New York City prior to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. What is Chelsea Clinton doing? Putting a little chapter in her book, She Persisted, on Clara Lemlich. Well, I'll tell you what she's doing. She's completely erasing the class struggle and all of the class struggle content from Clara Lemlich's work. I mean, that is basically essentially all of the content, turning her into a sort of shero. So this kind of thing happens a lot. Later in the hour, Kristen's going to be discussing the socialist origins of the holiday. But now we're going to look at some contemporary celebrations of the holiday. So everyone broadly agrees today that International Women's Day is about empowering women, right? But the definitions of what that looks like really have nothing to do with the original spirit of the day. So the first thing that I want to pull up is this one from E! Magazine, it's a quote from Lady Gaga. For anyone who needed to hear this on International Women's Day, I'm going to read this out loud to you. I had a boyfriend who told me I'd never succeed, never be nominated for a Grammy, never have a hit, and hoped I'd fail. I said to him, someday when we're not together, you won't be able to order a cup of coffee at the fucking deli without seeing or hearing me. So to pause on this a little bit, this is a common interpretation of International Women's Day, right? It's like owning bad ex-boyfriends with your stunning individual success. Do you see that a lot when you look at current iterations of International Women's Day, Kristen?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely. I mean, there's this way in which the kind of sort of girl boss feminism that you're talking about, liberal feminism, it has this way of just kind of like defanging the original reason for this holiday, which is to link women's struggles to broader struggles for social and economic inequality in society. And so this idea of making the holiday all about kind of like owning the men somehow and like really targeting patriarchy is completely anathema to the ideals of the women who founded this holiday back in 1910. So if you think about somebody like Alexandra Kollontai, for instance, we have records of her literally heckling what she called bourgeois feminists, right? When they were giving, speeches at various congresses in Europe. And so it's really unfortunate to suddenly see that this really important sort of socialist tradition is being like made into somehow like, oh, I'm so, awesome that you're going to regret not being my boyfriend or something like that in the future. It's really weird.
Right. So let's go to the next one. This is a random Australian politician. So I apologize for the fact that you may not have heard of him. He might not be particularly important in Australian politics. I don't really know. I'm not super familiar. But I do think that this is kind of goofy. I mean, this guy, from what I can tell, is a run-of-the-mill corporate centrist. He had some scandal where he got in trouble for saying that, teachers only work, 2/3 of normal hours, and therefore they only work 2/3 of a real job and should be paid less. I think it would be great if in the United States, people got in trouble for saying stuff like that. But in any case, here's his after saying that teachers, of course, majority women, should be paid less. Here's him celebrating International Women's Day by, from what I can tell, randomly giving flowers to women at the airport. It sort of seems like he thinks that International Women's Day is like Valentine's Day. And it seems to speak to a pretty profound confusion about the meaning of the holiday. That said, you have an article in the New York Times about how you think that International Women's Day should replace Mother's Day. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's different from randomly giving out flowers to women at the airport?
Right. Well, I do think, so first of all, it's important to know that in many countries where you do celebrate International Women's Day as sort of a bank holiday, like it's a paid day off of work, and many of these countries are former state socialist countries in Eastern Europe, it is not uncommon to give women flowers, right? Women, they like getting flowers. Flowers are fun, right? You've got my little rose here. There's a symbol of socialism. And I think that, we talk about bread and roses and things like that. But the reason that I wrote this piece in the New York Times in 2019 for International Women's Day was that I don't think we should only appreciate women for being mothers, right? In the United States, we have Valentine's Day, which was a kind of like romantic holiday. And then we have Mother's Day, which is also kind of a sappy Hallmark holiday to sort of, buy something nice, like a little pendant that says #1 mom or whatever. This one day a year that you sort of say, hey, mom, thanks for like giving birth to me and raising me or whatever. But that International Women's Day is about recognizing women as women independent of their role as mothers or partners. And that's really important. Like, hey, I value you as a human being, as a member of society who does important things rather than simply as a mother or a romantic partner. And so, in my own personal life, about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I can't remember when it was, I decided to stop sending my own mother flowers for Mother's Day. She was not happy about this at all. And I started sending her flowers for International Women's Day. And it took me a while to convince her that this was a good idea. But in the end, she understood why I was doing it. And I think she thinks, okay, my daughter is weird, but she really appreciated the sentiment behind it, which is, hey, like, I like you and respect you irrespective of the fact that you're my mom.
Okay, this has me convinced that of all of the examples that I've chosen, the Australian politician Devon Sharma is more off the hook than everybody else because the flowers actually are nice. You've convinced me. However, he should not have said that teachers should be paid less. All right, moving on to the next example. Reese Witherspoon today tweeted, "Women hold up the world. We are the authors, directors, and creators of our own stories and collective history. Today, we celebrate supporting each other and fighting for change." It's not terrible. I think it's kind of trite. I think it's relatively meaningless. I don't think it's suffused with a history or I don't think it's suffused with the concept of struggle, even though it mentions change.
Right.
And
And
furthermore,
Barbie clapping.
Barbie
I mean,
responded.
Barbie responding is so funny. Like, yes, Barbie, we are out there like fighting for change. I'm not so sure about that, Barbie.
Right.
It would be fun if they did like an IWD Barbie edition, you know, who was out there with her. She had a fist raised in the air somehow. That would be fun. But no, I mean, the Reese Witherspoon one, it just seems kind of, as you said, sort of trite and a little bit kind of missing the spirit of the holiday. I mean, at least she's acknowledging that like it's something that women around the world care about, but it's not really again, it's not really talking about what this was supposed to be about, which is not just fighting for change in some sort of kind of vague way, but very specific changes about labor rights, right? About creating wider social safety nets that are expansive and that don't let anybody fall through the cracks, thinking about working class women, not just the writers and the directors and the creators, but the frontline workers and the people who are in the grocery stores and driving the public transportation and all of the other really important work that our society needs. We know that now more than ever during the pandemic. Let's celebrate them too. And that's what the spirit of the holiday was about originally.
Yeah, I think that there's a common conception that International Women's Day has become sort of like World Cancer Day. Like it's an awareness raising day, but like raising awareness of what? Of women. I mean, everyone's aware of women. Women are over half of the population of the world. So that seems kind of useless on its own. And people will sprinkle in words like fighting for change. Like our friend Reese Witherspoon does say that we want to fight for change, but there's nothing specific about what kind of change. And if you press people on the specifics, they will say, change for women, just pro women change. Well, I agree. Obviously, we should have pro women change, but the delineation of demand seems to be missing from nearly all of these sort of pop culture examples of International Women's Day celebration content. So let's see. This is one that you brought to my attention, Kristen, when we were keeping an eye out earlier today. Let's look at a video from Google. I actually think it's a little more sophisticated in a way than some of these like kind of like trite ones, but it actually also misses the spirit of the holiday in a significant way. Can we watch this video?
Yeah, this is the Google Doodle from today.
Right. So what do you notice about this video, Kristen?
Yeah, I mean, it's primarily, again, the accomplishments of professional women. So it's judges and scientists and newscasters, and journalists and astronauts and plane pilots and soccer players. It's all of these sort of aspirational professions that women did fight very hard to have access to, but it completely ignores, right, this sort of reality of most women in the United States who are in working class positions, right? Or even it kind of ignores teachers, which I find really problematic, and nurses, right? Which we really need right now more than ever. And so again, I think Google is a little bit more sophisticated than some of the others, but nevertheless, to make it about women in the professions is really to reduce the holiday to a particular set of liberal feminist demands.
And do we have final evidence now that in the United States, nurses and teachers have been kicked out of the professions? Has Google finally closed the book on that, the proletarianization of teachers and nurses? But yeah, to your point, I agree with you. I mean, I think also that there's some value for girls in seeing this kind of messaging. But I also think that, the older women get, the less likely it is that they're going to be an astronaut if it was ever likely to begin with. And I actually think there's something really harmful about the idea that that is how you should define your worth as a woman, is competing in the professions against men. Most women are retail workers, most women are servers, most women are home health aides.
Exactly.
And also, even when it comes to messaging for girls, I mean, most girls' moms work in those kinds of jobs as well, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I do think that this kind of like professional aspirational messaging can be a bit condescending, and it's just like very focused on a particular class of women. So speaking
Absolutely.
of class differences between women, and speaking of women who work for hourly wages, let's take a look at this one from this last week's character of the week, Kristen Cinema.
Oh, yes.
So happy International Women's Day, Arizona. Today and every day, I'm grateful for the extraordinary women who paved the way for me and so many others in law and in life. So again, connecting back to that sort of the
Yep.
Google video, in law and in life, right? But more importantly, Kristen Sinema just voted down a $15 an hour minimum wage in the United States. 59%
Which would
of the
largely
people who that would
benefit
affect.
women.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's nearly 60%. So, she basically told them all to go to hell by voting no in a very
Right.
condescending and strange way on $15 an hour.
Exactly. And it's very much a kind of blaming the women who are not in law or not in the professions, right? Well, you had the opportunity to be an astronaut or a soccer player, or a scientist or a judge, but you didn't choose. You chose to be a hourly worker for minimum wage. So it's not my responsibility to pay you a decent living wage. I mean, that's the weird thing about this hypocrisy of saying that you appreciate women, but you don't actually want to pay women for the work that they do and the value that they create in our society. I think that's really, really problematic. It's so weird.
Well, to get to that transitions nicely into the next slide, some women do get paid. These women, for example, do get paid. That would
I
be
am limitless. Oh my God. I don't know who came up with that slogan. It's interesting.
Like, it's both like very vapid and useless. And also it's kind of menacing in the hands of Sheryl Sandberg and Ellen DeGeneres, because Sheryl Sandberg is worth like $1.8 billion. She is essentially limitless. Ellen DeGeneres is not far behind, only a measly $370 million to her name. There are very few limits aside from like mortality itself on just the actions of and opportunities for these women, but they're so rare, obviously. And I think that, to your point, there's something sort of inherently condescending or blaming when you talk about the idea that if women were only more confident, and if only we could create more avenues for women to lean in, as Sheryl Sandberg would say,
Lean in.
it does suggest that a lack of confidence is the main reason why so many women don't make a lot of money or work in jobs where they don't make a lot of money, which obviously there's no critique in there of the capitalist mode of production whatsoever. Our reliance as a society on people to do work and the expendability of workers, all for profit for capitalists.
Absolutely.
But some people are limitless. Other people are quite limited.
Yeah. And I think that, remember that in that book, Lean In, she also advises women to like sit at the table, right? Like make sure that you put yourself front and center, make sure that you participate in capitalism, because the more you're willing to participate in capitalism, the better your opportunities. It's a very market oriented kind of condescending attitude, as if the reason that women are struggling in our society is because they're not trying hard enough. I think a lot of women are trying really, really hard. Many of them are working multiple jobs. They're working full-time or more than full-time for less than a living wage. And that comes back to the Kristen Sinema thing. Like, how can you possibly justify, right, paying people less than a living wage and then saying that you appreciate women? Those things seem very orthogonal to me.
Let's move on to the next one. You may have noticed before when Barbie showed up, just like chimed in with the claps. Brands are all over International Women's Day. They're all over it in the usual way, which is just like, we love women, hooray women. This is a twist though from Burger King.
Yeah.
I think speaks to our current moment. Burger King tweets, "Women belong in the kitchen." They do this on purpose to generate outrage.
Yep.
Because outrage is clicks, and then people are talking about Burger King all day long. That's just earned media right there. And
right.
then they flip it, and they're like, if they want to, of course, yet only 20% of chefs are women. And then they say that they're going to give a scholarship to promote female Burger King employees pursuing their culinary dreams, which of course is a bait and switch for the aforementioned livable wages.
Exactly.
That Burger King is clearly not only, sort of like positionally against, but actively agitating against and obstructing living wages for its employees.
Yeah. And, Burger King is sort of taking a page out of McDonald's playbook, because I think it was 2019 or 2018 when for one day McDonald's turned its M upside down to make a W for International Women's Day. So the golden arches became a golden W for women for one day. But again, it did not translate into a living wage or any kinds of benefits or health insurance or anything, right? It was just, okay, women, thanks for letting us extract your labor for all of this time. We're going to turn our logo upside down for a day. And it generated, not surprisingly, a lot of outrage, which was clickbait for people, and everybody was talking about McDonald's. So I think Burger King got a little jealous there. There it is. Yes.
And practically, what does this look like? I mean, I was just looking at Fight for 15's Twitter page the other day, and they profiled a McDonald's worker who said that because McDonald's pays her so little money, she has to have multiple jobs, which means that the only time that she gets to hang out with her kids is when she's driving them in the backseat of her car doing Uber delivery. So that's what that practically means if McDonald's is fighting against paying its workers $15 an hour, which is the bare minimum. I mean, frankly, they're living on $15 an hour is pretty difficult, right?
Yeah.
So, but thank you for turning the M upside down into a W. That's very clever. Okay, I saved the best. I saved the best for last for you, Kristen. Check this one out.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, Fearless Girl.
So, well, they added a new update to Fearless Girl. Just today, they unveiled, if you're not familiar, Fearless Girl is a statue outside of the New York Stock Exchange, which shows that it's there to inspire little girls to dream about becoming blood-sucking parasites who exploit people through complicated financial instruments and don't do anything useful for society. So that's what the statue is for. But now they've added an addition to the statue in celebration of International Women's Day, and the addition is shards of broken glass, which frankly seems very dangerous to me.
Yeah.
Surrounding her, indicating that she has shattered the glass ceiling to bits. So we've come a long way from the 1910 what was it, Socialist Women's Convention,
right,
to a statue out front of the New York Stock Exchange, encouraging little girls to become as evil as possible. So yeah. Well,
I mean, that's just really, it's such an interesting thing. And again, I think what's so fascinating about this is that International Women's Day, it was established in 1910. It became an official global holiday in 1975. But because it was associated so strongly with the socialist countries, we never celebrated it in the United States. We preferred things like Mother's Day. And I think it's 1993 or 94 when Representative Maxine Waters from California tried to actually make it a holiday in the United States. And the bill never even made it out of committee, right? We were so hostile to this holiday, which was seen as kind of a militant women's holiday. And suddenly now in the last couple of years, it's just become a way for brands to promote themselves and for people to kind of like give a kind of, a pom-pom shake to women's rights rather than actually doing anything substantive to actually support women in our society.
I mean, I think that's it in a nutshell, right? In the United States, we got International Women's Day eventually, but not as a holiday from work. Instead, as a hashtag for brands to promote themselves and celebrities to do, get eyeballs on them or whatever. I don't even know why somebody like Ellen DeGeneres would participate in something like this to begin with. What is she getting out of it? I have no idea. But I will say, let's return back to our competing event, the Clinton Pelosi Teagan event. So you tipped me off to the fact there actually was a little bit of outrage about this event, but it wasn't outrage about the fact that the three featured speakers have, and I did the math on this, a combined net worth of over $300 million. That was not the source of the outrage. It wasn't outrage about the fact that Clinton and Pelosi were part of, the vanguard of welfare reform, which screwed over millions of people, especially parents, and of course, chiefly women, or that, the war hawks in both parties, very much including the Clinton and Pelosi, helped march the United States into interminable conflicts in the Middle East that have sucked up public resources, which has served as a basis for or a pretext for austerity. And then, of course, resulted not only in lost American lives, but many more lost Middle Eastern lives, including scores of civilians, and many of whom are women, and of course, all of whom are beloved by women, belong to families, right? And it's not about the fact that these two are I don't know about Chrissy Teigen, but Clinton and Pelosi are stalwart opponents of Medicare for All, which would not only liberate people regardless of their gender from the burdens of medical debt and expenses, but an under-discussed aspect of that is lift from millions of women's shoulders the burden of caregiving by economic necessity without adequate resources, which is something that I really don't think we talk about enough when it comes to Medicare for all. So instead, so given all that, those are my highlights. What was the concern over? The concern was instead that the women who were originally featured on this event were all white, which is truly one of the least troubling things about them, in my opinion. So they included inaugural poet Amanda Gorman as the moderator. Problem solved, right? International Women's Day has been saved.
Yep. The fundraiser has been saved, right? So yeah, I think that, and also just as a moderator, right? So again, the key billing are Clinton and Pelosi to raise money for these Democratic PACs. And, again, completely divorced from what this, holiday was about. Now, to be fair, I think it is worth saying that people have pointed out that Mother's Day is also, been co-opted by capitalism in all sorts of interesting ways. It was originally a pacifist holiday, and it has been completely stripped of its own political meaning, and it's just become a day to sort of buy flowers and cheap pendants at Zales or whatever. And so I fear that International Women's Day is just another thing that's going to be on the corporate calendar. There's a website somewhere called Easy Promos, which is where corporations can get ideas for promotions to run. And they had several suggestions for International Women's Day. So you can do like buy one, get one free ice cream at Baskin Robbins, or I think Clinique was giving away a free chubby lipstick or something like that on International Women's Day with any purchase, of course. So it just ends up being another thing on the calendar to get people to part with their hard-earned money to buy stuff that they probably don't need.
Well, I mean, it's not like this everywhere, right? I mean, I wanted to also point out that for all of the examples that I ran through, which again are more or less random, just sort of cherry picked from around the web, the spirit of International Women's Day is not like globally dead. And in fact, in India right now, there are thousands of female farmers on hunger strike to mark International Women's Day today. And International Women's Day is a big part of their messaging for this hunger strike. And then in Myanmar, there are thousands of women participating in protests against the coup there today under the International Women's Day banner. And they're doing this in conjunction with strike action led by labor unions. They're holding some sort of traditional cloth that is associated with women and culture, and but it's like very much linked to a militant pro-democracy struggle, and in this case specifically linked to labor struggle and class struggle as well. So that is very different from Baskin Robbins promotions. It seems like there's a wide spectrum of International Women's Day, but I think we've talked enough about what it means now. I hope that helps people understand how kind of crazy it is that the origins are what they are. So I want to transition to hearing you talk about what exactly are the origins of International Women's Day.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting story that a lot of people don't realize because of the way that it's been so corporatized in the United States. So, originally, the inspiration for International Women's Day comes from an uprising of needleworkers in the United States in 1908. Which leads in 1909 to the creation of the first sort of permanent trade unions for women in New York. And the Socialist Party in the USA at the time, led by Eugene Debs, actually promotes this idea of a national day for women, especially for women workers. So in 1910, there is a conference in Copenhagen. It's called the Second International Conference of Socialist Women. And it brought together a wide range of women from across Europe. And Clara Zetkin represented the German women. She was very instrumental within the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and she was mobilizing women. She was hoping to win the franchise for women to expand the working class vote in order to support, the expansion of labor rights and so on and so forth. And she had the support of a woman named Alexandra Kollontai, who was the Russian delegate at that time. She was a Menshevik. She was more of a social democrat. She later becomes a Bolshevik and the first minister, the first commissar of social welfare in the Soviet Union after 1917. And they managed to establish this holiday, which is called International Working Women's Day. And originally it was later in March to commemorate a very important date of the 1848 uprisings in Germany. And then it's first celebrated in 1911, massive demonstrations of women in Germany and Austria at the time. And Kollontai writes about this beautifully. She describes how important it is to see women out there in the streets, women out there fighting for their rights as part of a broader class struggle, which I think is really important. So the origin of the holiday has to do with mobilizing women to be part of a broad-based social movement for workers. And the date is officially moved to March 8th in 1913. During the First World War, not surprisingly, it becomes hard to hold Women's Day demonstrations, largely because of the belligerent parties not allowing women to travel, not giving them passports, for instance. I think there are International Women's Day demonstrations in Norway, I believe, in 1915, 16. And but really importantly, what people don't realize, and this has to do with a kind of a weird calendar issue, which is that what is called the February Revolution in Russia, which is the 1917 demonstration that leads to the abdication of the Tsar in February, it happens on February 23rd, which is why we call it the February Revolution. But that is based on the old Julian calendar, which is the calendar that they used in Tsarist Russia at that time in 1917. But by the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar that we use in the West, it was March 8th. It was a Women's Day demonstration. And what's interesting is that the workers in Petrograd at the time were hoping to have a big mass demonstration against the Tsar on May Day. So they were kind of hoping that the women would stay home. But the women go out into the streets. They're angry about World War I. They want bread and they want peace. And this massive demonstration of women ends up sort of catalyzing all of the men from the factories to go out onto the street. But it's very clearly, if you see images of this demonstration on February 23rd / March 8th, it's very clearly a women's demonstration. And as a result of this demonstration, the Tsar abdicates 4 days later. And so when you have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, what we call the October Revolution, which by the Gregorian calendar happened in November, you have an immediate recognition that women's activism, working women's activism, played a really essential role in the overthrow of autocracy in Russia at that time. And so, you know, in the 20s, International Women's Day becomes an official Soviet holiday. It's originally called Working Women's Day. Its name is eventually changed and it becomes International Women's Day. In 1965, it is declared an official, what they call a bank holiday. So it's like a paid day off of work in the Soviet Union. And this holiday is celebrated, of course, in all countries that followed a sort of socialist path to development. So not only in Eastern Europe, but obviously places like Cuba, Vietnam, China, and so on and so forth. It's a great day of women's solidarity, not only with each other across national boundaries, but also with working class men, with this ideology so that people will take over, collectively own the means of production and thereby create these more just societies. And then in 1972, a large umbrella organization called the Women's International Democratic Federation. It is a coalition of leftist and progressive women from around the world. So it's not just East European women. It's French women. It's women on the left from Western Europe. It's Japanese women. It's Australian women. It's women from what we call now the Global South. They petition the United Nations to create an International Women's Year. And the United Nations declares International Women's Year for 1975. And it is in 1975, as part of International Women's Year, that, as I said earlier, the holiday of International Women's Year becomes established as an official UN global holiday. But again, as I've said, it is often associated with the interlinking of women's struggles with larger social, political, and economic struggles. And so International Women's Day in 1975 is also an opportunity to fight against things like apartheid and neo-colonialism and colonialism. It's a day of mobilization for women who are speaking out about all forms of oppression, particularly capitalist forms of oppression and imperialism. And so it does not have the same salience, obviously, as a holiday in the West, largely because it's sort of seen as an anti-Western holiday. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, slowly this holiday, I mean, it still continues to be celebrated. And I also think it's really worth pointing out. I said something earlier about how in some countries you get flowers and chocolates. It sort of feels like kind of Mother's Day. In other countries, it's a day of radical protest. In the former Eastern Bloc countries, in some countries, it was a really beloved holiday, like in Bulgaria, where I do my research. People really enjoy International Women's Day. And in Poland, apparently, it was a pretty beloved holiday. That's not true so much in the Soviet Union, partially because once it was a paid day off of work in 1965, it created opportunities for men to just get really drunk. And that was seen as very kind of unfortunate outcome of making it an official holiday. And also women were sort of expected to kind of prepare a meal for International Women's Day. So here's this day when you're supposed to be celebrating women, and then women have to cook in order to celebrate themselves. So in the Soviet Union, it was kind of not as, I mean, some people really still remember it with great fondness. And in the last couple of days, I've done some interviews with Russian news outlets about the importance of International Women's Day in Russia today and in some of these East European countries. But it's worth pointing out that it wasn't always a great holiday. In Czechoslovakia, many people didn't like the holiday because they sort of thought it was sort of a fake celebration of women's emancipation, not really like there shouldn't be an International Women's Day. The whole year should be International Women's Year, right? You don't need to recognize women's accomplishments and women's contributions to society for just one day. You should be celebrating them all the time. But anyway, slowly, I feel like what's happened is because it's a holiday with this wonderful long history, and because it's so easy in the United States to kind of ignore that there were these other strands of feminism, right? So liberal feminism, what people like Kollontai and Zetkin would have called bourgeois feminism, which is a sort of focus on suffrage, focus on married women's property rights, focus on women entering the professions, very much like the Google Doodle video that you showed. Those were the concerns of liberal feminists who wanted essentially to work for women's rights within the capitalist status quo. Women like Kollontai and Zetkin, who would have considered themselves really socialist women's activists, and they would have avoided that word feminism very strongly, they were much more interested in transforming society, transforming the political and economic system together with men, together with working class men, to create a more just and equitable society for everybody, not just for women, and certainly not just for wealthy women. So because people in the United States don't know about that other strand of feminism, it's been sort of erased from our collective history. I think it's very, unfortunately, easy for a holiday that has this radical history like International Women's Day to kind of be co-opted by Baskin Robbins and Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton, unfortunately.
Well, the history that you told us is like very interesting and exciting, but have you considered that Reese Witherspoon's fashion line is actually having a sale today for International Women's Day, and so that you can actually purchase a leather backpack that was designed by maybe not Reese Witherspoon, but if you buy it on sale, the money will go to a woman-owned business, and that woman is Reese Witherspoon. So, so that's another way. It's another way to do International Women's Day, No, yeah. So I actually wanted to pick up on a thread that you mentioned, which I think is very interesting. It's a tough question. We probably could talk about it forever, but I'd like to hear you expand on it a little bit. Zetkin and Kollontai wouldn't have called themselves feminists, you said, necessarily, because they would have associated that term with bourgeois feminism, which they were quite opposed to. Completely semantics aside, obviously, it's been 100 years and terminology changes. What are the differences that they were speaking to at that time between what they considered to be, their sort of like women's socialist advocacy versus bourgeois feminism? And then do you see that bourgeois feminism that they identified like carrying over to the present day in the kind of dominant strain of feminism?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what they were really railing against was a particular sort of instantiation of women's activism, which required women to kind of be their own social movement independent of collaboration with working class men or men at all, really. Men were seen as the enemy. So patriarchy and not capitalism was the primary target of their ire, so to speak, right? They thought that they needed to win more rights from men within the prevailing political and economic system. And so if they had more opportunities, for instance, to enter the professions or to own their own property or to vote, that they would be perfectly happy to accommodate themselves to capitalism as long as they were able to compete on capitalist labor markets on an equal footing. And I think that idea, right, which is, it totally underpins the kind of girl boss feminism that, you know, Sheryl Sandberg is talking about in Lean In, and that has become very popular and prevalent in our culture today, where we're concerned with the percentage of women on corporate boards or the percentage of women in power. You know, we have a female vice president. Isn't that great? So having a few really key kind of role models, and then not really dealing with the sort of structural issues like statistical discrimination that fundamentally create a situation in which women's labor is devalued because they have a social expectation for providing care work in the home. This is something I've written a lot about. And many people are talking about, obviously, with social reproduction theory and the work of Sylvia Federici and Caliban and the Witch and a variety of other sort of left feminists who have been critiquing the way in which capitalism really exploits women's unpaid labor in the home. So the socialist feminists really, and part of this is also a structural issue. Bourgeois feminists, liberal feminists want to organize as women against patriarchy. And of course, if you're a socialist women's activist, you want to organize together with men against capitalism, against exploitation, against the employers who are extracting your surplus value. And so that is a very different strategy. And unfortunately, what that means is that for the entire history of these two separate strands of feminism, is that liberal feminists have often criticized left feminists for prioritizing class issues over gender issues, right? And that has always been a critique, that because socialist women or left women, progressive women want to work together with men to build a more just, equitable world, that somehow they're prioritizing their class identity over their gender identity. They're not paying enough attention to patriarchy. And obviously, people like Clara Zetkin and Alexandra Kollontai would say the opposite, that liberal feminists, bourgeois feminists are certainly prioritizing their gender identity over their class solidarity. And so that tension, I think, goes back all the way to the beginnings of women's activism. And as I've pointed out in my book, you know, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, is that, you know, we tend to think of these sort of socialist ideals as being more of a late 19th century, early 20th century thing. But they go back much earlier to people like Flora Tristan, who was writing in the 1840s. And very early on, if we go back to the utopian socialist, the ideals of socialism, the ideals of liberation for working people always were connected with women's emancipation. And I think it's a real mistake to forget that those two strands kind of got born into the European context at the same moment, and they really kind of grow up together in this left socialist strand of feminism that has been around, again, since the 1840s.
Yeah, this tension has always been there. I'm reminded of an article that I wrote for Jacobin. Let's see what it was called. It was called How Class-Conscious Women Garment Workers Shaped the Movement for Women's Suffrage. And when I was researching that article, I did find these debates going back all the way to 1909 in the United States as well. And it's an interesting story. Rose Schneiderman, who is often credited with the phrase "bread and roses" because of a powerful speech that she gave. So that phrase actually comes from a poem that she was quoting. But she was, a popular and important labor leader in New York City at the time. She had advocated for, along with Leonora O'Reilly, who was another garment worker and labor leader, they had advocated for, strategic coalitions with bourgeois feminists on the question of women's suffrage. And they faced a lot of pushback from others in the socialist movement, other women in the socialist movement who said, you can't trust these bourgeois feminists, it's going to come back and bite us in the ass. And the way that story, I don't want to say ends, but a twist in that story is actually the Uprising of 20,000, which was a massive strike that happened before the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And we've mythologized the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in American history, but what a lot of people don't know is that the reason that happened is because there had been a strike that was unsuccessful in securing new workplace safety regulations. If the strike had gone on longer, if it had been stronger, perhaps they would have been able to win those concessions from the employers, and then perhaps all of those women wouldn't have died at work. And that one of the reasons why that happened, why that strike was unsuccessful, is because there was a coalition of women suffragists, sort of more bourgeois women, who had provided financial support to the strikers until they felt that the strikers had become unreasonable, because the strike was sort of dragging on and the union was questioning whether or not they wanted it to continue, and the women wanted to continue striking, and it became kind of muddled. And so the financial support kind of dried up and the strike failed. And it was after that that Rose Schneiderman, who had advocated for these strategic coalitions with the bourgeois feminist movement for suffrage, actually gave a very powerful speech at the Metropolitan Opera to the high society, to the sort of like progressive high society at the time, where she condemned them for having blood on their hands. So these tensions go all the way back. I think they're unresolved, because honestly, when I think about it, I think that, strategic coalitions with bourgeois suffragettes actually does make sense. And there are reasons why today it makes sense for socialists to work on things in tandem with feminists whose primary concern is patriarchy, not capitalism. But if we have similar, short-term demands or goals, then like numbers are numbers, and political education happens in struggle. And so, you can see why it makes sense. At the same time, historically, it has always been fraught, right? And that tension is actually embedded in the history of International Women's Day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see that the most clearly in the experience of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, when Alexandra Kollontai is the Commissar of Social Welfare. And with the full power of the state behind her, Lenin empowers her to a cabinet position. It's a really important position that she has. And she goes out there and she starts building kindergartens and nurseries and public cafeterias and public laundries and canteens and all of these sort of state-driven things to support working women. And as you can imagine, she also, Soviet women get the right to vote, and Soviet women have all sorts of other rights that are granted to them. But for the bourgeois women who were supporting the whites, what are called the whites, they largely leave Russia after the revolution, because their property is all being expropriated in order to redistribute resources to working women. And I think that that's where the rubber really hits the road, where, somebody like Sheryl Sandberg, who is I Am Limitless, right? With her, what did you say, $1.8 billion personal fortune? Is that what you said it was? Yeah.
Yes.
So, she's going to be all fine with a kind of like girl boss, try harder, lean in, work more feminism, but she's going to be very uncomfortable with women who are advocating for a world where one person should not personally have a $1.8 billion personal fortune, right? So that's where it's going to be difficult. And yeah, I agree with you that we need to build coalitions. And of course, we have to throw in race as well, right? So there's a way in which this sort of debate between class and gender has historically also erased issues of race and ethnicity. And that's also something that needs to come in. So when we talk about things like intersectionality, we're talking about bridging all of these different vectors of difference, and building coalitions so that we can actually get things done. But at the end of the day, and obviously I also want to say that I think patriarchy is a problem too, right? It's not as if we get to let patriarchy off the hook here. But the question is, if we look at the historical experience of women's organizing, when there has been really profound transformation in women's lives that is long lasting, it is largely in social movements where something about the larger political and economic system has fundamentally changed. And it's not about just giving a handful of women equal access to the boardroom, right? That's nice for the women who get there, but it is something that can very easily be taken away. And we've seen, right, the regression of women's rights in many countries when, if they don't have the kind of fundamental transformations of society, the sort of systemic factors that perpetuate sexism. And the key one, I think, being statistical discrimination, so that it's economically rational for employers to discriminate against employees who have primary child caring responsibility or caregiving responsibility in the home for elderly relatives or sick, members of the household. And so because those workers are less reliable, then employers sort of build that into the wage, which means that they pay women less because there's this assumption that women have primary caregiving responsibilities, and therefore they're likely to withdraw from the labor force. So then in heterosexual couples, when there's something like a global pandemic, for instance, and somebody needs to homeschool the kids, somebody needs to run the household, well, who are you going to choose? You're going to make the economically rational decision always to choose the member of the household with the lower wage, right? You're going to want the person with the higher wage to keep working. And since that is systemically going to be the gender that is associated with not having to withdraw from the labor force in order to do care work, that means that this is a vicious cycle that will always repeat itself unless the state comes in to create really robust social safety nets to make sure that women aren't constantly having to withdraw from the labor force in order to do unremunerated care work in the home.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I really want to draw out a little bit. So, first of all, a terminological note, when we say bourgeois feminism, we're not talking about like if you are bourgeois then and you're feminist and that's the type of feminist that you are.
Yeah.
It's not a one-to-one relationship. It's like, there's bourgeois feminism embodies the sort of like bourgeois values, specifically like achieving women's empowerment through the sustenance of and fortification of capitalism, or attempting to achieve or achieving some women's empowerment. Sheryl Sandberg and Ellen DeGeneres' empowerment.
Yes.
And so
and Reese Witherspoon. Let's not forget
exactly.
Reese. Right?
Let's not forget Reese. There's a sale on the website, so don't forget that. To go back to sort of where we started, the Lady Gaga example, like we talked originally where we started was like she had a shitty ex-boyfriend and she wanted to prove him wrong. I mean, that's completely understandable. Where that's not an object of ridicule. It's the idea that
Right.
is some form of like collective self-action. But like that is like a real thing, right? And I want to say that I want to concede that while all people are capable of behaving badly to all other people, there are certain ways in which men are not only likely to, but encouraged to behave badly to women that can be demeaning at best and harmful at worst. So modern bourgeois feminism, I think, has two central projects. One is more women represented in its highest ranks, or in the highest ranks of the society, which we've discussed. And the second one is, I think, a project of like civilizing men or ending their worst behavior toward women. And the former project, I think we can agree, is basically useless. Like, if anything, it just sort of beautifies ugly institutions, right? That ought to be, dismantled and replaced. The second project is less useless. I mean, I think everyone can agree that we would like to see domestic violence against women, and that we would like to see sexual abuse of women, and so on.
I also think that patriarchy, it also harms men, right? In the sense that like the pressure that is put on men to be a provider, right? I think there's a survey from 2017 that showed that something like 70% of Americans believe that in order to be a good husband or a partner, a man has to provide, right, for his family. And in an economy where there aren't enough jobs, or there are not enough good jobs, I mean, men would also benefit from a higher minimum wage, for instance. So patriarchy, obviously you're right. There is this sort of civilizational mission to make men behave better. But I think there's also, you got to push that question back. Well, why are they misbehaving in the first place, right? And when you think about the kind of fantasy of the family wage, of the patriarch, of somebody who can take care of his wife and children, if we're talking about a heterosexual family here, of course, that dream, right, for some people, what they consider like the ideal, has been taken away by the particular form of neoliberal capitalism that we have in our society right now, with outsourcing and automation and all of the other structural things that have been going on that have left many, especially working class men with high school degrees, really abandoned them. And we see increases in suicide rates, all of these deaths of despair, the opioid crisis, all of these things. Well, one of the things that I think happens is when men feel emasculated, right? We can either start to trouble the gender binary. We can start to say, well, maybe we should have more expansive ideas of what it means to be a man or a woman, what it means to be a partner in a relationship. Why do we even need these categories? But I think there's this other tendency which we're seeing, which is to try to compensate for your inability perhaps to be a provider with sort of extreme masculine kind of macho behavior. And that's being encouraged by many populist leaders around the world, not just in the United States, like a kind of reassertion of your authority as a man, not based on your ability to be a provider, but based on your ability that you're just a man, right? Just reclaim patriarchy without the economic resources. And I think that that's, it's not just about civilizing men. It's very much about understanding that capitalism reinforces and reinscribes patriarchal norms in really insidious ways that are not only harmful to women, because they are obviously very harmful to women, as you point out, in cases of domestic violence and, sexual assault and so on and so forth, but also they are very harmful to men. Right? Because men are also victims of patriarchy in our society, not only the expectations that they may fail to live up to, a patriarchal ideal, but also when other men lash out against them, right? As a way of reinscribing some kind of patriarchal authority in a society and an economy where men feel really emasculated by what's been happening. Right?
Yeah, this is precisely where I was going with this, which is that, like, even if you feel, and I think we both feel, that like oppressive behavior from men to women is like a very real and relatively widespread phenomenon, it doesn't follow then that the type of feminism that's most suited to address that is a feminism that primarily focuses on sort of educating men. And in fact, you advance a separate thesis in your book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. And to sort of sum up like what I think the thesis is. The idea is that not only what you just said, which is like raising living standards for men will probably have a stabilizing effect on like the male psyche and just men's lives in general, but furthermore, stabilizing women's lives economically gives them a degree of economic independence that allows them to extricate themselves from abusive situations, and thus from the sort of roots up actually transforms the power balance that results in these kinds of abusive behaviors. So like, where is abuse, sort of broad term, happening? Primarily, it's happening in the workplace and in the home. So if you're going to make it more possible for a woman to be able to leave her job or leave her home, then you're going to make it less likely for a man who's being abusive to actually get away with a degree of abuse without kind of repercussions in his personal life, such as losing an employee or losing a spouse or a girlfriend, right? So
Absolutely.
can you like draw it out a little bit? Is there anything like because you did research on this?
Yeah,
so it's not like
no,
just
and
a
I
theory in
think
your
that,
head.
again, as a social scientist, we want to look at some kind of empirical evidence here and the transformation of these East European countries from state socialism, which, again, as I say in the book, and I've said in many things, had a lot of its own problems. I'm not trying to paint like a rosy picture of that, but to really think about the ways in which when you go from a society where women have high levels of economic independence because they're supported by robust social safety nets, not because of some girl boss feminism, right? Not because they're slaying the boardroom, but because they live in a society with subsidized childcare, with paid parental leaves, with, reasonable supports for working women, so that, and they have careers and they have education and they have opportunities, so that, yeah, if you're in an unhappy or abusive or otherwise unhealthy relationship, you can leave. And it turns out there's a great poem from I believe the Soviet Union. If I have a second, I could probably find it, where it turns out that men self-civilize when they realize that their wives might leave them, or as you said, a valuable employee might walk out of the workplace. The reason that women are so vulnerable is that they're economically dependent on men. They're economically dependent on particular forms of employment. If women have more choices in their lives, right? And this is one of the things that I like to really hammer. People always imagine that socialism makes people somehow less free. That's the kind of argument, like it's a violation of our liberty and our rights because we'll be less free if we live in more robust societies with more robust social safety nets somehow. But in fact, we become more free, right? 25% of women in the United States, I believe, under the age of 65, get their health insurance through a spouse. That means you're not only, because we have employer-based health insurance, many people are trapped at their jobs, but many women are trapped in their relationships because they can't access basic medical care without remaining in perhaps an abusive or unhealthy marriage. And I think that, one of the things that we see really clearly, again, when we look at the empirical evidence, and that's what I try to do, is to marshal all of that evidence together in the book, is that in societies where women have a more societal support for their caregiving roles through an expanded net, of social services, men behave better towards women. And partially that's, and relationships actually improve because there's people are attracted to each other on the basis of love and mutual affection and attraction, right? And emotional affect, and not on whether or not this guy can pay your rent or whether or not you're getting health insurance through that relationship or whatever. So I do think that, like, if you look at, for instance, in the book, I talk a lot about the GDR, old East Germany. Men, explicitly who grew up in the GDR and then lived in West Germany talk about how much more power they have as men in capitalist West Germany than they had living in socialist East Germany, because women could leave. Women had complete economic independence. They could walk out of a relationship without any negative financial repercussions. And, lo and behold, it turns out that men, will behave better if there's a real threat of losing something that you value. And I think that's really important. I really think that we need to rethink the goal of women's activism, to go back and reclaim these different ways of thinking about how we can build societies that will be better, more just and equitable for everyone, including women and men, rather than just hoping to get a few exceptional women into the C-suite or into the vice presidency.
Yeah, it's precisely right. And I think that, they're not just historical precedent for this, there's also contemporary examples. And I think you and I are both big fans of an article that's now becoming iconic by Katie Baker called Cock Blocked by Redistribution.
Yes, I love this article.
Great
Cock
article.
Blocked
Go
by
read it, anyone who's
Redistribution.
listening.
Yes.
It's sort of about the author discovered a pickup artist type, men's rightsy guy whose primary interest is like
Bruce B was his name. Yeah.
Right. Who had complained about how difficult it is in the Scandinavian social democracies to exert the type of power over women that he was used to in other countries. So people should go read this if they want to see how this thesis could function in the present day. And then speaking of the present day, I want to ask you, is International Women's Day, is it doomed? Do we need to scrap it and pick another holiday, or is it possible to reclaim International Women's Day? And to the latter point, I would ask, if we are building a new type of political consciousness, the socialist movement is growing, then is it possible to take International Women's Day back for that movement, or have the brands and celebrities got it?
So I refuse to let it go. I really do, and I was really pleased. I have a college-age daughter who sent all of her, female professors International Women's Day greetings today. And one of her professors who'd grown up in the Soviet Union was overjoyed that somebody knew about this holiday and how important it was to her. And my daughter shared this email of her just sort of saying there was this recognition that a young college student would reach out and say, "Hey, Professor so-and-so, happy International Women's Day." I respect you as a role model. And so I don't want to give it up. I think that we have to try to claw it back as much as possible. I'm doing a lot of this, and tomorrow I'm giving a keynote lecture at the University of Kansas on the socialist history of International Women's Day in order to try to remind people not only of the importance of this holiday, but also the ways in which socialist attention to women's issue kind of catalyzed the women's rights movement in the United States. We also have something new like Lux magazine, right, which is a new socialist feminist magazine that I think is also trying to reclaim and re-energize the kind of socialist feminism, left feminism that I've been talking about, that we've been talking about for this last hour. And so, yeah, I'm always really disappointed in some ways when the brands and the corporations and the Barbies and Reese Witherspoons of the world try to co-opt these things. But on the other hand, as somebody who has sent, flowers to her mom, for the last decade or more on International Women's Day instead of Mother's Day, my mom has a high school degree and, worked as a secretary for her entire life. And so she didn't know anything about this socialist history. She doesn't know about all of the work that I do. But for her to finally see that, whatever Baskin Robbins has an International Women's Day, a special or something like that, like she suddenly realized that I wasn't completely crazy and that this was an important holiday. And I do think that even though there's this real risk of co-optation and that International Women's Day might go the way of Mother's Day, which is really unfortunate, it does give us an opportunity to get out there and talk about this other strand of feminism. This is like the third event I've done, or fourth event that I've done in the last 48 hours around International Women's Day. And I do think that we can use the opportunity to educate people, to talk about these different ways of organizing for women's rights and women's emancipation and women's liberation within broader struggles for liberation and emancipation. And so even though I fear the co-optation and it annoys me when I see, the Google Doodle or the Pelosi Clinton event or, some of the tweets that you showed, which just the Burger King thing, which just seems so ridiculous. And I know that it's just a publicity stunt. I think it gives us an opportunity to push back and to point out that, hey, there are other things that we can do rather than just getting women into the boardroom. We could actually challenge this whole political and economic system, which has created the kinds of systemic inequalities that we feel and we're all struggling against in the world today.
That is a perfect place to end it. Kristen, I want to thank you so much for coming on. Everyone who's watching, I want to thank you so much for tuning in when you had so many other wonderful options, including the Clinton Pelosi event. I actually, I think it's still going on. So if you guys want to hop on over there, check it out, let us know.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much, Kristen. And
thank you for inviting me. This was really wonderful. I really appreciate having the opportunity to kind of go off on you and go and talk about all this. And it's been so much fun to just sort of have this sort of what I think of as like a vent session about how frustrating it is that this wonderfully radical holiday is being co-opted by the liberal feminists.
No, it's perfect. Well, happy International Women's Day to you and to everybody. Thanks,
yes,
everyone.
Happy International Women's Day. I'm going to show you like roses for everybody. Yeah, like virtual roses to all.